President, I rise today to talk about the very real effects that sequestration is having on, I'm going to speak about the people of Virginia, but I'm sure it is, as the presiding officer, equally true about folks in New Mexico and, for that matter, all across the country. I'd like to remind folks that sequestration was set up so that we'd be so stupid, so draconian, so outside the realm of possibility that no rational people would ever let it happen. Well, we're actually seeing now that we didn't pass that bar. Sequestration is happening. It's actually stupidity on steroids. Earlier this week, a group of us heard from Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the NIH. The NIH, as we all know, is America's premier health research institution. Dr. Collins told us of the real-world impacts of sequester cuts. He gave heartbreaking examples of life-saving medical research that's being disrupted, perhaps irrevocably, due to budget cuts and employee furloughs. 2 days ago, I had the opportunity to chair a budget committee hearing about the impact of sequestration on our nation's security. We heard policymakers talk about what sequestration was doing to military readiness. But what drove home the point to me was a Virginia business owner, Mark Cleet, who had actually been named as the Small Business Man of the Year back in 2011, who said that this start and stop environment where you didn't have any predictability of whether your funding was coming through was completely wrecking his business model, and it already had caused him to bench over a third of his 60 employees. Now, Mr. President, in the last 2 weeks alone, since sequestration has started, I've received over 500 letters, emails, phone calls from Virginians who are bearing the very real brunt of our failure to do our job. Real consequences on real people with potentially devastating impacts on a dedicated, experienced federal workforce. This is no way to run a business. It is no way to run an enterprise as large as the federal government. One from Virginia Beach, and Hampton Roads and Virginia Beach is our most concentrated area with naval installations and Air Force and Army installations. This woman from Virginia Beach, whose husband is a retired Navy officer, is now furloughed once a week for the next 11 weeks. She writes that her husband came home with a letter about the furlough, but he felt his moral character and the oath he'd taken to protect his nation would not allow him to write, so she said she was going to write. And I quote, she says, "It pains me to see what he has worked so hard to defend. You're working so hard to tear down. The country is deserving of good leadership, and right now Congress is not providing it." Another Navy employee from Fredericksburg area writes, 3 years of pay freezes followed by a furlough seriously makes me question if this is where I want to spend the rest of my career. Think about the hours and dollars that we as a public have invested in getting these individuals trained to provide these services, now saying they're not sure this is where they want to work. A woman down in the Portsmouth Naval Hospital writes, "Both my husband and I are DOD employees and will be taking a 20% pay cut for 11 weeks. She points out that they may be able to get by, but a lot of her coworkers just don't know how they're going to make ends meet. A federal employee from Woodbridge, Virginia, down the road in Prince William County, says, quote, "I want all my elected officials to know how disappointed I am that they have abandoned and let down by our representatives in Congress." Continues by saying, "I have 3 children in college, and I am paying for college loans of 2 children who have graduated. 11 furlough days don't sound like much, but over the year, the loss of nearly $4,000 in income is crucial. If I ran my own budget like this, I'd have to fire myself." This employee, I don't think, is going to get a sequestration discount on repaying those student loans. A West Point graduate and Iraq War veteran says, quote, "The failure of Congress in having a tangible and real negative impact on people's lives and livelihood. I do not see leadership, I do not see accountability, and I do not see selfless service that rises above partisan politics." And finally, a former Army officer who lives in Springfield, Virginia, says, quote, "The morale in our agency is so poor that most workers who used to work 10 or 11 hours a day are now planning to work their exact 8 hours only. So that 20% cut, 1 day a week, is actually cutting productivity in a much greater percentage." You know, Mr. President, I could stand here the rest of the afternoon and go through letter after letter that had the same theme. What strikes me about these letters, and I'm sure, again, the presiding officer's hearing from New Mexicans, and we're hearing from Virginians, is that none of these letters are talking about the red team or the blue team. None of these letters are saying this is all the Democrats' fault or the Republicans' fault. None of these letters are saying this is a House problem or the Senate's got the solution. They're saying, regardless of party, regardless of whether you're in the House or the Senate, your job is to get this fixed. It is appropriately targeted at the entire Congress. And while our dismal performance recently may be great fodder for late-night comedians, I think having a 90% plus disapproval rating candidly undermines Americans' basic faith in our democratic institutions. So let me try to respond to these Virginians. Here's what I have done and will continue to do. I'll keep fighting for the significant federal workforce that lives in the Commonwealth of Virginia. In the 4.5 years I have been in the Senate, I come down on a regular basis to celebrate the great work of individual federal employees. I'll continue to come down to the floor and appeal to my colleagues and provide real examples of the real impacts that this funny name sequestration is actually having on people's livelihoods. On a personal basis, I'm giving up 20% of my salary through the end of this budget year. I'm donating it to the Federal Employee Education and Assistance Fund, which provides emergency loans, as well as child care assistance, scholarship, and other financial help for the families of federal and postal workers. I will continue to work with any colleague, Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, Vegetarian, it doesn't matter, who's willing to try to get to yes to replace sequestration in a more rational way and get our debt and deficit under control. I'm proud of the fact that the 3.5 years that I've been, now I guess 4.5 years I've been here, there's no issue I've tried to work harder on. I was proud of the fact that I was one of the founders of the so-called Gang of Six that built upon the very good work of the Simpson-Bowles plan. And let me remind my colleagues, anyone who thinks there is a solution to this problem that is not going to involve raising additional revenues and starting to reform our entitlement programs either can't read a balance sheet or hasn't grasped the magnitude of this issue. So I will continue to advocate for a balanced bipartisan blueprint that will work on these issues. Raise the revenues, not to grow the size of government, but to pay our bills. Make sure that the promise of Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security are here not just for today's generation, but for future generations in a way that's responsible. We're soon coming up, and I know many of my colleagues and the American public probably got to budget fatigue after the ends of the fiscal cliffs and super committees and debt ceilings. Thought, well, maybe we're past a little bit of that. Well, the economy's recovering and the size of the deficit is decreasing. But our challenge is still in front of us. We are soon set to come to the end of this fiscal year, which will present these issues again at the end of September. The debt ceiling will be not far after that. I've heard that there's only slightly more than 20 legislative days left before the new fiscal year starts. It is incumbent upon us to recognize, to reflect the voices of these Virginians who, again, don't call out red team, blue team, don't call out House or Senate, but say to us in Congress, implore us to do our jobs. I know we've been joined by my colleague, the senator from Maryland, and I think we could debate whether Maryland or Virginia is more ground zero for the negative impacts of sequestration. But whether it's an NIH worker in Bethesda or a civilian Navy employee in Woodbridge, the stories are the same. This is not fair. It is not right. None of these folks are getting a 20% discount on daycare, rent, or as the one person said, repayment of their student loans. It is incumbent upon us to get this problem fixed, and that is going to require the kind of hard work on revenues and entitlement reform that so many have tried to avoid. Otherwise, we will not see an America that will stay as competitive as it needs to be, and we will disrespect the literally hundreds of thousands, not millions of workers who work directly or indirectly, protecting our nation and trying to provide the services that are so essential to our people. Let's not do any more harm, and let's not waste any more time. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.